right? That would be kind of his reputation until today. As one of the pillars of Latin American identity, culture, politics, literature, and philosophy, Ariel has been influential like few other books have. As the first wide-ranging proposal for Latin American identity, Ariel quickly became one of the most prevalent paradigms for understanding Latin American difference at the dawn of a new century and in the face of rapidly shifting geopolitical conditions. In fact, the genesis of Ariel was 1898. It was published in 1900, but he began writing it in 1898. That can be traced to the US intervention, right, in Cuba. Imbued with anxieties about the encroaching moral influence of the United States in the hemisphere, indeed what would turn out to be the tipping point of American imperialism in the region, Rollo's visionary treatise offered an optimistic antidote of agency to what many feared as a threat to the sovereignty of their soon-to-be occupied countries. As an intellectual, ethical, and spiritual breviary for Latin American youth, Ariel condensed many issues, which honestly I don't have time to go into all of them, but I'm going to highlight a few. First, it summoned the mystical, eternal, and constructive powers of youth against the mutilation of the spirit by deterministic ways of understanding the world, such as positivism or evolution, or utilitarian pursuits. It also linked aesthetics and morals in a serene project that sought to harmonize extremisms, right? So hyperpartisanship, for example, was one of the targets. Moreover, it set up, although others had done it previously, metaphorical protagonists that were quickly taken as stand-ins for Latin America and the United States. I'm referring, of course, to the Ariel and Caliban dialectic that draws from Shakespeare's The Tempest, but gets filtered through Ernest Renan's use of it in France. I mean, we're looking for sort of like, what are the stereotypes that structure sort of South-North relations in this hemisphere? Ariel was a really important text in fomenting or generating some of those stereotypes, right? So in the South, what are the sources of empowerment for Latin peoples or Latin America? Spiritual superiority, right? An aesthetic sort of consciousness in a way, right? The United States, materialist, crass, vulgar, etc., right? I mean, this is one of those texts that really, again, Jose Marti had highlighted some of these things before, but really it was Rollo's text that popularized these ideas, that kind of gave them an extra leg, if you will. But overall, it gave young people a fuller sense of self and obligation that prior pedagogies, and galvanized them to intervene in civic and political life and forge a more constructive, hopeful future. So Rollo's idealist vision for Latin America gave rise to a movement called Arielismo, without which, as Mexican intellectual Enrique Krause points out, 20th century Latin American intellectual history cannot be understood. According to Krause, young people in Latin America awoke to the 20th century reading Ariel. Editions appeared throughout the entire continent in such a degree that in Peru, like many other places, young intellectuals formed Arielista groups. Part of Jose Vasconcelos' work in the 1920s, The Cosmic Race, for example, a prophecy of Latin America as a melting pot of races and cultures, can be seen as a variation of Rollo's topic. The Bolivarian echo of Arielismo was not lost on those writers, that is, the ideal of a nation of nations united by, in Rollo's words, the lofty values of the spirit. The Arielismo that they preached was, in short, the first alternative ideology generated in our countries against classical liberalism and its direct descendants like positivism and evolutionism. As time passed, Arielismo constituted an antecedent or a complement, whether close or remote, unspoken or explicit, to the most looming and impassioned ismos in 20th century Latin America: anarchism, socialism, indigenism, nationalism, Hispanism, populism, fascism, and communism. Even though it is credited with informing so many isms, Arielismo itself has largely eluded critical study. My initial incursions into Arielismo were animated by the ubiquity of that label, as well as the coherency attributed to it. As a designator without clear reference, which makes the constitutive features that connect its practitioners both pervasive and elusive, Arielismo reads like a default gesture of categorization, a catch-all for a wide range of cultural, anti-imperialist, political, philosophical, and sociological issues and stances. That is not to say that Arielismo was completely an artificial construct, since its most clear manifestation was as a youth ethos. More than any other source of its time, Ariel was responsible for spawning student political protagonism in Latin America, as it spoke directly to young people and provided a way for them to see themselves, both individually and collectively. As numerous student groups formed throughout the region, many named themselves after Ariel, as well as their publications. And Rodó's influence in this realm was brought into really sharp relief in the Congresos Internacionales de Estudiantes Americanos, the first of which took place in 1908 in Montevideo, which is no coincidence. Rodó's from Montevideo. Rodó attended the conference. They asked him to speak at the conference, right? And the next one was 1910 in Buenos Aires, and then 1912 in Lima. So really, this is like the first, the first years of what could be considered like a collective consciousness for student political protagonism in Latin America. It's not to say there were not efforts before in groups, et cetera, but what you have here is really a continental effort. You have students coming from all throughout the Americas to attend these conferences, right? And to talk about students as a political force, what their needs are, what they want to do, their goals, objectives, et cetera, right? And you even had students from the US kind of attend, which is kind of an interesting point to think about as we move through this talk. And with each of the conferences, I started to notice, because I was looking at these issues, sort of archival research that published talks from the conferences and what was going on, et cetera. And I noticed there was increasing integration of Arielista language. In other words, what Rodó wrote in his book was kind of being reformulated, right, or reproduced in students' language, what they wrote, how they were thinking, et cetera. Their rhetoric, their precepts, their platforms, which culminated in the Argentine University Reform of 1918. It's interesting, now we're a centenary away, right? We're the 100-year anniversary of that event, which kind of gives us a moment to rethink many things, but for my purposes, Rodó and student political protagonism, 100 years on. And of course, that event in 1918 set off a flurry of other university reforms throughout the region, which had been going on before that time as well, that achieved curriculum changes, student access, many other issues that we could talk about. But one of the issues that initially animated my interest in this project was the fact that literary history has, at one point or another, grouped the bulk of Latin American essayists in the early 20th century under Ariel's monopolizing umbrella. In other words, during that time, the genre of the essay in some ways became synonymous with Arielismo. That diverse writers, philosophers, politicians, educators, critics, conservatives and radicals, Christians and atheists alike, would get conflated as Arielistas certainly curtails the variety and complexity of their work, and in many cases, the need to even read them. The objective of the book I'm writing is not simply to exaggerate Arielismo's relevance or negate its existence at a chronologically significant moment, which is the centennial of Rodó's death, which was last year, 2017, right? However, in order to speak with the specificity that has been lacking, in my opinion, it is crucial to recenter key pieces that have largely been left out of the equation, the work of the so-called Arielistas themselves, which necessarily requires close readings of their text. Recognizing Arielismo as an expedient shorthand for a grouping based on loose and largely unspecified criteria opens up productive avenues for rethinking not only their peripheral place within the literary philosophical canon, but also their centrality in cultural and political panoramas of the early 20th century. Despite repeated allegation of Rodó's obsolescence, which had been going on for nearly a century, his influence continues to reappear and reformulate in important ways in this century. While my starting point for this project is Rodó's most famous text, Ariel, my book, rather than trace the extent of his vast influence, aims to examine what gets concealed by the designator Arielismo. Therefore, I focus on the ways in which so-called Arielistas ran with Rodó's message and tasked Latin American youth with carrying out an introspective project of self and spiritual development as a first step in resisting U.S. influence and for reforming their democratic institutions and carving out a more harmonious future for their respective countries. The centennial commemorations of Latin American independence in and around 1910 were not just motives for retrospectively taking stock of the past. They were also opportunities to imagine and interpolate a new kind of exceptional agent, what I call in this book the Centenary Subject, which is synonymous with the Arielista subject. That is the audience that was being interpolated. And the concept of interpolation refers to the constitutive process where individuals acknowledge and respond to ideologies, therefore recognizing themselves as subjects. Therefore, attending to the textual and rhetorical configurations of the somatic, sociopolitical, psychological, and affective dynamics of interpolation discloses the possibilities and pitfalls of Arielismo as a youth ethos. The Centenary Subject, I argue, had to negotiate mixed messages with respect to race and place, truth and belief, agency and sacrifice, as well as immediacy and futurity. In these foundational texts that straddle philosophy and history, the problematic contours of the superior subject reside in the interstices of inter-American and transatlantic racial simulations, epistemological stipulations, spiritual mediations, and recusant reformulations. In other words, I recenter the tensions that Arielista projects assumingly try to soften, when not eradicate, thereby exposing cracks in the foundation of Latin Americanist discourses of unity and empowerment in interventionist and imperialist environments. One of the ideas I revisit has to do with Rodó's status as a transcendent text. You know, if you look at the cover of the book, this wasn't the original cover, but you see sort of, right, the young person literally dissolving, going into like a different sphere, right? Sort of transcending the sort of base reality to think on another level, right? Put those reforms that we'll talk about in a second, you know, into action. So part of this thing as a transcendent text, which is evidenced in part by the rhetorics of racelessness that his text performs, instead of locating collective agency in the synthesis of different races, we could think about Vasconcelos, kind of taking it, you know, to one extreme with the cosmic race, or you can think a little bit earlier about Jose Martí, right, with Nuestra America, talking about sort of tapping into, in other words, not just exclusively white European sources of empowerment, but taking into account sort of the racial or ethnic realities of the region. Ariel traces the genealogy of Latin American identity to Greco-Roman civilizations, right? So it's a big leap, right? It's sort of negating the immediate environment and going way back to find a source of empowerment. So the first chapter of my book targets such normalized colorblind readings of race in Arielista discourses and examines the stakes and stipulations of white racial formations in and in between Peru and France, as well as Argentina and Italy. In the work of Francisco García Calderón and José Ingenieros, which are two of the most important intellectuals at the time, whiteness is not a presumed absence, but rather the nucleus of explicit, albeit malleable, transatlantic projects of white superiority. As I show, personal investments in and the rhetorical maneuvers of constructing whiteness in Latin America at the Centenary have broad implications for geopolitical imaginaries, imperialism, immigration, as well as the universalist assumptions undergirding foundational ethical pedagogies aimed at Latin American youth. Such Euro-ontological processes, as I refer to them, reveal a series of race-making strategies whose negotiations of Europeanness, paired with anti-blackness rhetoric, aim to bolster fragile white identities on both sides of the Atlantic. The second chapter transitions from the body of the Centenary Subject to the pedagogies that sought to shape its mind and spirit. The centennial festivities of Latin American independence celebrated overcoming turbulent pasts and accomplishing modernizing objectives in formal galas and grandiose public spectacles. At the same time, however, others looked to the future and advocated a different brand of autonomy that went beyond perfunctory patriotisms. In fact, the Centenary produced sophisticated and nuanced examinations of ideology, or false beliefs that masquerade as truth, for the first time in Latin America. Again, I don't want to overstate that, but what I'm referring to is there really is this coalescing moment in 1910 where Latin American writers start thinking very seriously about the concept of ideology per se, right? Not just how do we know what we know, how do we know that that's true, et cetera. Those kind of investigations had been done priorly, but really 1910 is this really auspicious moment to really kind of rethink things, right? And part of my argument throughout the book is the reason why it's called the Americas is because US imperialism is kind of like the specter that guides all of these meditations in a way. Right, we can't just attribute everything to the U.S. and none of it to Latin America, right? But that's kind of, I'm looking at it from a more sort of hemispheric perspective in that way. Diplomats, anti-imperialist crusaders, and university professors of diverse stripes called on young people to interrogate the superstitions of the past by way of reason and disinterested truth in order to break with the partisan and religious fanaticisms of their respective countries. Yet, as I underscore, those very interpolations for modernizing the mind floundered when they attempted to negotiate the role of the spirit, primarily in the form of religiosity, due to a series of concessions to what I term the ideology of affirmation. Spanning questions of serenity, unity, introspection, and consent, local and collective issues that took on urgent tones in an era of intense US interventionism, this chapter examines the contradictions, regressions, ambiguities, and excesses that arise in the contradictory messaging surrounding epistemological integrity, spiritual agency, and ethical heroism that the Centenary Subject had to navigate in Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, and Mexico. And this will be the third chapter, and then I'll get to the main point. In stark contrast to constructive interpolations of Latin American youth, the third chapter analyzes pedagogies of dissent in Colombia and Cuba. With the objective of demystifying the norms of personal sacrifice and moral obligation imposed on young people, iconoclastic philosophers like José María Vargas Vila and Fernando Yesi Verdalles deploy insubordinate proposals that actively corrupt the Centenary Subject as a way of deprogramming its mind, unfettering its conscience, and unleashing its true potential. These exercises in subject deformation find extreme forms of sovereignty and solitude, not solidarity, and debase the serene platforms of Arielismo with scandalous metaphors of ecotoxicity and suicide. In revisiting these messages of subjective negation, which have been neglected in literary history, I suggest that nationalist causes and canonical logics have either dismissed their viability as counterproductive or even subsumed their aggressive noncompliance into familiar antithetical forms, which calls into question the visibility of individual anarchism in Latin American literature and thought at a key moment in the region's history. The concluding chapter brings together the main points of the book and illustrates the ways in which Arielismo continues to inform a wide array of political projects and student protest movements around the globe. Furthermore, I signal how neo-Arielista perspectives in the 21st century resuscitate and reformulate Rodó's humanist rallying cry in neoliberal debates concerning representation and subalternity, which is what I'll turn to now. So this is mostly from the epilogue of the project. The passing of what some may assume is Rodó's last stand, the centenary of his death last year, brings yet another opportunity to address and perhaps affirm nagging doubts about the relevance of his work and his obsolescence to contemporary Latin American literary, sociocultural, and political landscapes. Indeed, a list of critiques surrounding his dated and problematic worldview is easy to assemble. Ariel's divisive class implications with respect to the masses, its paternalistic vision of democracies free of what he refers to as egalitarian excesses, its neglect of ethnic and gender diversity, not to mention its grandiose aesthetic that relies heavily on European ideas to the complete detriment of Latin American ones, seemingly have little to impart today. As opposed to the critical vigor aroused by the 100-year anniversary of the publication of Ariel in 2000, the centenary of Rodó's death has passed largely unnoticed, which in some ways solidified, as Carlos Fuentes suggested some 20 years ago, the idea that Rodó was, quote, the irritating, insufferable, admirable, stimulating, but ultimately disappointing uncle in the family portrait of Latin American literature. Someone we have to kind of, give props to, but then ultimately kind of, he bothers us, right? We have to kind of, we withstand his presence in a way. So straddling a liminality between lukewarm reverence and benign neglect, Ariel no longer seems the lightning rod for adulations and accusations that it once was, perhaps the inevitable result of over a century of meticulously litigating its every nook and cranny. But before we resign ourselves to such critical fatigue and move to place yet another of the many nails that have been hammered into Rodó's coffin over the years, it is worth pausing to appreciate the multitude of ways in which Arielismo continues to be recycled and repurposed in the 21st century. In my book, I argue that since its inception, however loosely pinpointed, Arielismo has been a malleable paradigm, a flexible set of ideas and ideals, as persistent as they are imprecise, that have been appropriated by virtually anyone for seemingly any purpose. Despite the contemporary exhaustion with all things Rodó, a variety of neo-Arielista perspectives and projects in a new century make clear that his relevance extends far beyond well-worn dichotomies such as Ariel, Caliban, and customary milestones such as these sort of arbitrary but kind of chronologically significant moments of people's death, 100 years, 50 years, etc., that kind of give us pause to reconsider some things. Rodó's resonance remains central to defining numerous aspects of Latin American realities. In his book, El Arielismo de Rodó a García Monge from 2008, Costa Rican philosopher Arnoldo Mora writes, quote, the prevailing geopolitical reality, and here he's talking about the Maria Rosa, right, the pink tide. The prevailing geopolitical reality in the first decade of the 20th century returns Arielista ideas and beliefs to their full actuality, although in a new version adapted to the current context. Arielismo is more than just a glorious page of our America's ideological and cultural history. Today it is more vigorous and relevant than ever. That Mora would consider the so-called pink tide or Maria Rosa, when a plethora of left-leaning heads of state were elected in South America, part of an Arielista trajectory, shows how far Arielismo has come. In other words, I don't think, Evo Morales is kind of what Rodó was thinking in 1900, right? Or like Chavez, like, the poor kid, mixed race kid from the barrio coming socialist platforms. I don't think that's what he was really thinking, but it's all right. Whereas since the 1920s, Latin American leftists lambasted Rodó's shortcomings, neo-Arielismo in the 21st century is largely aligned with progressive interests and causes. In fact, former Venezuelan President Hugo Chávez's defiant rejections of U.S. meddling in the Washington Consensus have elicited more than a few comparisons to Arielismo. While Chávez's Bolivarian stances on political liberation, cultural agency, spiritual superiority, and regional alliances are reminiscent of those Rodó outlines in Ariel, the Venezuelan president's militaristic credentials, confrontational rhetoric, and socialist platforms that serve and indeed recenter the very masses that Rodó's elitism sideline signal a blatant departure from Ariel's pacifying tones and subtle objections to U.S. hegemony. One need only recall the litany of insults that Chavez directed at former U.S. President George W. Bush, right, calling him a liar, a donkey, coward, drunk, murderer, etc. And from the podium of the UN and the United States, right, in New York, the devil. This is all from 2006, right? We can sort of think about those gestures, right, and those belligerent features of his so-called Arielismo, which, as it turns out, have precedents in Latin American insurgent traditions. So even from the 1920s, right, like Ariel is published in 1900, 1908, 1910 is really where we start to think about Arielismo as kind of this collective movement or collective conscious. The decade of the 1910, you have student political protagonism really coming on the scene, et cetera. But the 1920s, where you have this kind of more militant kind of shift in student politics throughout the region, like Julio Antonio Mella is the founder of the first International Communist Party in Cuba in 1923. Peruvian Victor Raúl Aya de la Torres, anti-imperialist Alianza Popular Revolucionaria Americana in 1924 in Mexico, right? Rodó and Arielismo have been cited frequently as sources for those projects, right? So it's interesting that they would, in some ways, they would maybe share some parallels, but for the most part, they would be pretty resistant to what Rodó was offering, right? Surpassing mere rhetorics of autonomy, the utopic ideals that Prospero, this is Rodó's narrator in the text, right? Prospero is like the teacher in the classroom. This is another reason why it really caught on with students, right? Because it's an essay, which the genre of the essay tends to get chalked up as kind of cold and like, intellectual history as such. But this kind of had a narrativized form. It opens with the professor speaking to a group of students in the classroom on the last day of class, right? So it kind of like got students drawn into that. It makes students imagine that the message really is for them because it's in their setting. So the utopic ideals that Prospero, right, the maestro, espouses in his serene sermon took on immediacy and bellicose connotations in guerrilla-resistant fronts, including Agustino Sandino's armed campaign against U.S. Marine forces in Nicaragua in the 1920s and 30s, Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution, the Fuerza Armada Revolucionarias de Colombia, or the FARC, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional in Chiapas, Mexico. These manifestations of what some have called armed Arielism, or Arielismo con metralleta, like machine gun Arielism, also encompass contemporary phenomena such as the Frente Estudiantil Revolucionario in Uruguay, and even internationally, the Libyan Revolution of 2011. Arielismo has always been constituted by such capacious accommodations, but generally in ways restricted to Hispanic and Lusophone contexts. Therefore, that one of the predominant Latin Americanist paradigms would be expanded to include diverse protests and liberationist projects around the globe demonstrates the extent to which its functionality as a coalescing prism transcends the region for which it was conceived. In fact, the Arielismo that inspired the Reforma de Córdoba has also been explicitly linked to the Arab Spring in 2010 in Tunisia, Egypt, and other countries in the Middle East. Throughout Europe, like Los Indignados in Spain, and student riots in London in 2012, as well as the numerous Occupy movements throughout the world. Interestingly, although leftist actors have long denounced Rodó as a representative of reactionary class structures, his work was also a crucial source for those very progressive projects and popular anti-imperialist mobilizations. In other words, with respect to student endeavors, Arielismo remains an unavoidable precursor and referent, which was reinforced time and time again when I interviewed student activists in Santiago, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Havana, Caracas. Most were quick to categorically reject Rodó's proposals, all the while reiterating the very tropes and hopes he spelled out in Ariel over 100 years ago, which some repeated without any irony, as if reciting a creed from an unknown source of legitimation. It is telling then that one of the Chilean students carrying the neo-Arielistas indignados signs admitted that, quote, it was medio en serio, medio en broma, right? So again, that's kind of like the duality we get with Rodó and Arielismo writ large, right? Is this idea of like acknowledgement on the one hand, but ultimately obsolescence, right? So it's interesting how, he's kind of playing with that. While such neo-Arielista, and this has the X, right? Neo-Arielista maneuvers make important space for gender and queer peoples and presences that are absent in both Prospero's classroom and Arielismo writ large. That platform implies first and foremost a critique of neoliberalism, especially the capital-driven privatization and utilitarian orientation of education. Although part tongue-in-cheek, neo-Arielista agendas within the Chilean student movement bring a sense of actuality, right, in the form of gender and queer inclusivity to what may otherwise be an anachronistic formula. Neo-Arielismo has emerged in recent years as a go-to for scrutinizing the neoliberal logic that views education in terms of economic value, which translates into the crisis or crises that the humanities continue to confront. At the same time, it resurfaces as a lens through which to understand hemispheric or south-north dialectics of the politics of representation, in a way that's kind of similar to the Mecondo movement in the 1990s, for those of you who know what that was about, right? Sort of resisting this idea of, Latin America as this exotic place, right? That the United States, what people from the US want to read about or to know about Latin America, at the exoticized thing, these prevalent images of poverty, sex, drugs, violence, et cetera, right? So this is very much, coming back around, not that it ever went anywhere, but, these sort of like, the exoticized images as emblematic or constitutive of Latin America, right? Inseparable from Latin American realities. So one person leading the charge against such rhetorics and representations is Grino Rojo, a Chilean writer, professor, whose explicitly neo-Arielista agenda laments the precarity of high culture in a globalized world as marginalized actors infringe on the privileged spaces of representation, which according to Javier Sanginés explains the rejection of subaltern studies, post-colonial theory, and multiculturalism on the part of certain intellectual sectors of Latin America. They consider them a type of colonization of thought by theories elaborated in the North American Academy from the perspective of what is often referred to as area studies. These intellectuals accuse post-colonial studies and subaltern studies of a kind of neo-Arielismo, in which the configuration of Latin America, of its societies and cultures, is given in an eccentric and anomalous manner. In this sense, Sanginés continues, the neo-Arielista position, still dominant in the cultural and academic strata in Latin America, reproduces the anxiety constitutive of the original Arielismo of Rodó and other modernists who manifest a proud anti-Americanism together with a contempt or fear of the masses and democracy. In his book, Latin Americanism After 9/11, John Beverly, who's another founding member of the Latin American Subaltern Studies Group in 1992, which is comprised primarily of Latin American professors in the United States or American professors in the United States, sees neo-Arielismo as part of a, quote, neoconservative turn in Latin American criticism, which could be seen as an attempt by a middle and upper middle class university-educated and essentially white criollo Ladino intelligentsia to recapture the space of cultural and hermeneutic authority from two forces that are also themselves in contention with each other. The first being the hegemony of neoliberalism and what are seen as the negative consequences of the uncontrolled or unmediated force of the market and commercialized mass culture. And the second, social movements and political formations based in identity politics of populisms of various sorts, which involve a new political and cultural actors no longer necessarily beholden to the political or strategic leadership of a university-educated and ethnically mainly European or criollo mestizo intelligentsia. Neo-Arielismo registers the anxieties of what was never intended as a populist paradigm. Interestingly, just as Latin American writers living in New York City at the turn of the 20th century took issue with what they considered Rodó's inaccurate portrayal of US culture as vulgar, materialist, devoid of spirituality, complete lack of culture, this century shows Latin America's intellectuals opposing reductive or distorted representations of their own countries and cultures from the United States. Part of the point I'm trying to make is that whether we realize it or not, an array of issues, many issues, most issues pertaining to Latin America and its relationship to the United States has a tendency to get filtered through this Arielista prism, still today. Well, the starting point for my book was interrogating the constitutive characteristics, commonalities, shades, shifts, and paradoxes of Arielismo as a formal movement or general perspective. Its principal objective has been to bring into sharper relief the fraught racial formations, epistemological strains, and anarchistic divergences that tend to get erased or subsumed by the canonical shadow of Ariel's influence. Read both with and against its requisite Arielista affiliation, the Latin American essay of the 1910s, which tends to get written off as predictable or inconsequential, emerges as a generative, dynamic genre through which the dimensions of and tensions between race, reason, religiosity, and individualism play out. By exploring the normalized and eccentric nuances of Arielista interpretations, imaginings, and impositions of centenary subjects, the heroic young agents tasked with an ambitious historical mission at an opportune yet inauspicious moment in Latin American history, the book seeks to demystify youth as a reified category or self-evident audience and highlight the mixed signals that politicians, pedagogues, and philosophers crafted with respect to their bodies, minds, and spirits in a new century of charged hemispheric conflicts and changing cultural and sociopolitical conditions. So just to kind of wrap up, we have plenty of time for Q&A, but I have to admit that I had to look up what swipe left meant. That's embarrassing, I know, but I missed the whole online social dating thing, so I had to do a little cursory Google search, right? And to find something unappealing someone unappealing, I think is like the main thing, right? Is that correct? Thank God. All right, great. Okay, so you're swiping left. There's obviously a swipe right. So what do I do with that? Obviously, it was kind of a little cute way to kind of broach this topic, but it also got me thinking about the social media platforms that were really important for my own research, right? Like seeing sort of these real-time developments when I was a PhD student, right? With the Chilean student movement going on, I was in New York City. How was I keeping in touch with this, finding out what was going on the ground? It was social media platforms. And a lot of, I was, I think, able to draw a lot of information from people's Twitter accounts, but also just online blogs that some of those students were keeping up and maintaining, et cetera, right? So it's kind of a little wink in that direction. But also, swiping left conveys the progressive shift, right, as Arielismo is a paradigm. But there are also sort of neoconservative slants within that, right? So, how can it be both things? How can we have sort of a leftist shift and a neoconservative slant right in the middle of it? The short answer to this is that this sort of capacious dichotomy that Arielismo sets up, right? Latin America, U.S., right, left, et cetera, right? It's a very dichotomous reading. There are always these sort of circuitous implications with respect to this paradigm. Reactionaries, radicals, and everybody in between has looked at one time or another to Arielismo as a source of empowerment or rejection, right? So it's kind of like this, it's an interesting kind of echo chamber in a way, right? It's like as you're fighting against it, you're also doing it. It also kind of fits in with like Marx's definition of ideology, right? They don't know it, but they're doing it in a way, right? So it's kind of like this sort of interesting source that can be traced. And so today, like in the last 12 years or so, you have Latin American intellectuals writing explicitly neo-Arielista agendas. They're titling their books like Ensayos Neo-Arialistas, right? So it's actually an explicit appropriation, looking to Rodó for something, looking to this Arielismo from the year 1900 for some sort of like strategies, suggestive strategies on how to navigate changing conditions, right? And part of the argument I'm making is that where we're looking for Rodó and Arielismo, neo-Arielismo, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, it's pervasive and ephemeral, right? It's normative and emancipatory, constantly. So it's sort of like it's this really flexible paradigm that can just be kind of marshaled for any purpose, right? Whether or not we realize it. So that's where I'll stop, just to kind of give you an idea of what I'm working on. So thanks for listening, and interested to hear your thoughts.
On the note that this is really flexible, and given that China is really increasing its investment in hegemony in the region, have student movements or just movements in general started applying neo-Arielismo to China?
Not that I've seen, and I think maybe part of the reason why is, it really stems from this South-North dialectic Latin American United States, right? So it's so ingrained in that context. It is interesting, I was talking about that, when I was saying like, in Tunisia or Libya or these other places, it's being applied. It's not like people on the ground there saying, we're Arielistas from Latin America. It's not that, but it's interesting that people in Latin America still have that conceptualization or applying it to these other places, right? But China specifically, I have not seen. Yeah.
Thank you. And then my second question was, your PowerPoint was very helpful, and I also noticed that you were taking notes. I'm trying to make a brief on this because I'm on the debate team, and it's really helpful.
Oh, yeah.
Would you be open to sharing your materials at the end so that I could convince them?
Yeah, let's talk. Stick around. We'll talk. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
I'm curious in following up, the way in which you are describing Arielismo, it resembles in a lot of ways some of the ways in which populism is talked about in terms of the emphasis on some sort of dichotomy, the notion of a flexible paradigm, that its formal content is a little bit ambiguous, but it can be taken and appropriated and applied, for a diverse range of purposes. All of that is also very characteristic of populism in the Latin American tradition. So I was curious as to how they connect or intersect or clash. But it is in some ways was this. Arielismo existed before populism really in Latin America, but in some ways does populism emerge as some sort of was it influenced by this intellectual tradition and the way in which it shaped political and cultural understandings in Latin America?
To answer the last question, absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. And that's one of the, the ideas of kind of like, it exists everywhere. Even if you don't think it does, even if while you're negating it, you're kind of like reaffirming it. You can do both things at the same time. But I think one of the things to think about is like, who is the audience for this book, right? Like Ariel. How many people have read the book? Okay, all of you. Great, wonderful. Yeah, Matias, good.
Your class, probably.
Probably my class, if I was guessing. Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult book, right? It's very difficult because it's based largely on European intertextuality. So, the original book was 40 pages long, and there's like a couple hundred intertextual references. It is packed. It is jam-packed with sort of this European thought, European ways of thinking, doing things, etc. Right? So that's one of the challenges. This was not meant as like a populist text, right? What he was arguing was essentially, what's wrong with U.S. democracy is that there's too much equality, right? We need a top-down democracy, right? I mean, these are very divisive class implications, obviously, right? But what's very interesting is you can have those ideas on the one hand, but then what happens when students start reading it, word gets out. Chances are, if you went to a Latin American school between 1920 and 1980 or 70, your teacher was probably schooled in like Arielismo. Their ideas regarding pedagogy and what students should be doing, who they are, etc., came from Ariel, right? So it's kind of like this invisible consumption in a way throughout Latin American history as well, right? So it's interesting that the initial idea was totally against populism. It was against the masses, right? It revealed a lot of anxiety about, sort of immigrants and the changing sociocultural landscape, etc. But then at the same time, it kind of has this kind of ephemeral or like, intangible presence that did operate, that did kind of foment this collective consciousness. It was a direct influence, as I mentioned, on student political protagonism coming together. It did galvanize sort of that, those efforts. It can't be exclusively contributed to that, right? You can't say, oh, well, students did this because this guy wrote a book. Not necessarily, but you can't extract it at the same time. Right? So that's another part of like this, what do you do with Arielismo? I'm not sitting here saying this is the most important thing and everybody should be reading it and doing it. Chances are you probably already think some of these things if you are a Latin Americanist, or you've consumed some of this information, or what you study is kind of imbued with it already, right? So yeah, but it is interesting that very quickly, 1920s especially, you start having different factions coming to the table. The founder of the First National Cuban Communist Party in Cuba, right? I mean, what does he do? He admits openly, Rodó. Right? What I'm doing, I got these ideas from Rodó. Communism and too much equality, they don't go together whatsoever, right? So it's interesting, again, that malleable part, what people can do, how it can be appropriated, reformulated, how these sort of paradoxes can coexist comfortably, seemingly. Yeah.
Did Aya de la Torre in Peru, he borrowed from this?
Absolutely.
He became a quintessential populist figure.
Exactly, and I think part of his thing was the anti-imperialist aspect. That was something, again, that predated Rodó, definitely. But like Rodot's, what happened even before Ariel was published in 1900, in 1899, a Uruguayan newspaper published saying, like, check it, this book's coming out, it's going to be great, check it out. It's an anti-American tirade, right? When you read Ariel, it's not. It's weak. It's like lukewarm. It's basically saying, hey, we need to watch out on this kind of like increasing moral influence from the North. But the U.S. has many great things to offer, right? Like what they're doing with respect to technology and advances and their sense of collective identity, we need to kind of not emulate that, but we need to appreciate it. So it's pretty lukewarm. People after that like totally destroy the U.S. rhetorically, right? Much more than he ever did. But that is what got attributed to his text. So it was immediately read through that filter. Oh, this is anti-American, right? Versus like Latin American empowerment. So even before it was published, it was already set up in this dichotomy that subsequently just got really, really flexible, right? A way to see, right? A way for young people to see themselves, to conceptualize themselves, to act collectively. Yeah. Thanks.
It's funny because it seems I never heard of it until today.
And that's very common. Don't feel bad, by the way. This is extremely common.
What was really interesting about this presentation was even when I like Googled it, I was like, oh, I still don't know what the hell this is.
Yeah.
And yet it seems like every other ism ever, where just after 100 years, everybody's being accused of it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to be it.
Sure.
And then,
yeah.
So I guess was there any sort of, I'm having trouble. What was it, in its heyday, in those eras, kind of just treated by some as like, this is incoherent. Like, I can't even hate this or support it. It's just incoherent. Like, yeah, I don't.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I really appreciate your frustration because this has been my life for years, trying to figure out sort of what this is. I'm coming in real close, Bill, to get some water. Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it. Okay, so what started me getting into this, did it even exist? That was the first question I asked myself because, when I was a grad student, I was doing all this research, looking at literary histories, reading articles, etc. And this term, Arielismo, was thrown around everywhere. Now that you know it exists, you'll start seeing it in a lot of places, chances are, right? It was everywhere. And I asked myself, okay, as a literary and cultural studies scholar, how can there be this ismo, which professors love so much, right? How can there be an ismo and nobody's really sure like what it refers to? Why are we not asking the same questions about Arielismo that we do about Romanticismo, Surrealismo, naturalism, symbolism, you name it, right? Every other ism kind of has its like critical due. But this is one of the most frequently utilized terms, and yet I was very confused on like, what does that even indicate? So my first step was ontological. Does it even exist? It is a critical fabrication, right? It's not that the essayist that I'm studying stood up and said, I am an Arielist. No one ever did that. But at the same time, the student protagonism, that was huge for me because I did see, yes, you can draw a direct line from A to B, from Rodot to them, because they're saying it. They're not saying like, we are Arielistas, but they're saying, if it wasn't for this guy and everything that he wrote, we wouldn't be where we are today and doing what we're doing and making the strides, the accomplishments that we haven't accomplished the things that we set out to do. So in a way, it's sort of like, again, another dichotomy. It's artificial, but it did exist in some form. And so for my purposes, I kind of narrowed down like where did it manifest itself? And the anti-imperialist dichotomy, South-North, absolutely. Youth political protagonism, you bet, right? But the reason why you're kind of confused, and this is a brief presentation, but it is so many things, right? What Rodot manages to accomplish in this short essay is incredible because, again, talking about, in speaking to youth directly, not for the very first time, but in this wide-ranging way in Latin America, it was the first, right? Introspection, look inward, right? Don't let these new circumstances of technological advances and capitalism, all these things sort of mutilate your spirit. There can't just be one way of knowing, right? It can't be like we're all subject to evolution and biologism and that's it. There has to be room for the spirit, the aesthetic dimension, right? Good versus evil, all that stuff, right? There has to be like this other aesthetic, spiritual realm that helps inform what we are, how we exist, and what we think, and where we're going, right? So it's a very complete sense of self that he's trying to foment sort of internally with students, but also they have that obligation, right? There's that social obligation of, yes, you are getting the education, you're looking inward, but it has to be projected outward. You have to enact reforms in your countries, right? You have to assume some kind of role. It can't just be abstract sort of reasoning or philosophy. There needs to have some sort of a socio-political component attached to it. So, that's like two kind of quick entrances of the text, but the way I would think about it is a very wide-ranging, encompassing, totalicizing sense of self, individually and collectively, that, as we talked about, just kind of gets translated into so many different ways, right? That cleared up all your confusion, I know. Matthias, thank you.
Stepping from that question, the answer you were giving just now,
Yeah.
I was wondering, like from a more like methodological level, how would you? Because I mean, if you ask me, like writing a book about Arielismo is terrifying because, as you were saying, it's so huge.
Yeah.
So how do you like decide like exactly what you write on, and like how do you pick?
Good, yeah. Time and frustration, I think, are really important. Those are like the two essential components. I started out writing a book about Arielismo. The book's not really about Arielismo anymore. The three main chapters that I glossed quickly but did not go into, that's really the bulk of the book for me. So yeah, initially, writing a book about Arielismo, I was like, oh man, this might be a stretch. How many times can you read the word Arielismo? You've heard it probably 100 times today and you're probably sick of it, So I mean, how can a reader kind of stay up with this? That's why it became the introduction, which is explaining kind of how I came to the topic, what forms it took, and then the epilogue, which is kind of what's done with it nowadays. The chapters in between focus on essentially the genre of the essay 1910 to 1920, looking at racial formations, the ways in which sort of these rhetorics of whiteness are parsed in inter-American and transatlantic context, number one. And then you have sort of the deeper dive into epistemology in the second chapter, which is again the idea of ideology. How do we know what we know? What are our sources of information? Talk about relevance today, right? I mean, this idea of like, what role does the spirit have in young people's lives? Those kinds of things. And then looking at the third chapter, sort of the anarchistic part, right? So talking methodologically, I kept seeing, for example, this name of this Cuban essayist that I was really interested in exploring, and nobody had really ever worked on him. And I noticed that he was exclusively categorized as an Arielista. What happens once you categorize somebody something? Let's say like an essayist. He's an Arielista. You don't have to read that person's work, because you just have to read Rodó's work. That's the gesture I'm kind of like resisting a little bit, right? Is that during this decade, you have some of the most pivotal interventions, whether it be, politically, aesthetically, et cetera, that have been, in my opinion, largely written off, understudied, because they are categorically categorized, as Arielistas. So like Manuel Ugarte, right? Huge anti-imperialist crusader from Argentina, traveled the Americas on his anti-imperialist campaign. He's an Arielista. Most people don't read his works today, right? Francisco Garcia Calderon, exact same thing. Some of the deepest dives on Latin American identity around 1910, its political history, ethnic makeup, etc., largely unread, and over and over and over and over again, right? So methodologically, the point in finding this Cuban philosopher was, well, what makes this guy an Arielista? And then I read his work, and he could not be more diametrically opposed to what Rodó did, right? So in a way, it's sort of like the echo chamber. Once something, you can think in linguistics, the initial baptism. What happens once you call somebody something and it sticks? That's it. That's the reputation. That's the way they are categorized. That's where they fit in, etc. So part of it has been kind of this counter reading of what makes these people Arielistas, but without exclusively kind of adhering to that point, because I think I can make that point effectively intro, conclusion, but the middle parts I think are the racial formations, right? The projects of anarchism that just get kind of subsumed under this really like a large umbrella term that can kind of mean anything for anyone, and why even kind of talk about it at that point? So that's kind of like my methodology is pushing back against that categorization. Yes, ma'am. Thanks.
Another question I had is, when you're talking about the populist movements that emerged in Latin America and linked to Arielismo,
Yeah.
How do they link? Because I know
Good.
you said that he criticized democracy.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and again, I want to reiterate, the argument I'm making is not that, the primary identification of these movements is Arielismo. That's not the argument, right? But what I have been looking at, especially in the epilogue, and this is kind of why the book became about something else as opposed to just this, right? I'm looking at ways in which people in Latin America or in other parts of the world reach out, conceptualize what they're doing or what other people are doing as Arielismo. Kind of like this easy referent to have, right? But what you noted is the problematic part. I mean, once we start talking about, like machine gun aerialism, the 1960s as machine gun aerialism, like the radical 60s opposed Rodó viciously, right? So how can they oppose him and at the same time he formed like an important part of their project? It's again these paradoxical appropriations I'm talking about, yeah. So that's basically it. It's not like there are these long, elaborate sort of like, Arielista projects with respect to student protests, right? Part of the paradox I'm examining is, they kind of speak out both sides of their mouth. They say, no, Arielismo, screw that. That's totally what we're opposing. What are you for? And then they name 6 things that come directly from Rodó.
So would some of those things be like imperialism and basically, regardless of if you're a student or not, the idea that you need to introspect and project that outwards to inform policy?
Exactly, yeah. Reform your democracies, right? Intervene sociopolitically, the introspective element that you mentioned, right? All those things that derive from Rodó. Thank you.
Like in respect to like the populist gestures, and because it seems to be this weird like relationship between how they're reading him or how they thought that he should have been read and the relationship with him. It seems to me they're only really picking up the anti-imperialism, right? But like if it is being pulled up by these sort of populist movements, I mean, where is it taking place that in your regions that you have seen that might be a little more inclusive? Because even in, I think, for some of the populism, it's still a certain amount of elitism, and I'm not so sure how racially inclusive that is for a place like Latin America.
Right. Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. Yeah. I mean, I see it where it pops up. I'll say that, right? It's like I see it wherever it pops up. So but the question of like, elitism, I think there's some of that still. But I mean, maybe one example I can think through this. Student protests in Latin America, right, have a tendency to get filtered through this Arielista lens. So what's going on right now in Nicaragua, right? Some of the students involved in those protests, right, are they right-leaning, are they left-leaning? That's not really the point, right? But actually it is part of the point, because initially it would be considered like student political protagonism from the right in Rodó's case, right? Top-down democracy, let's get all these masses out of here and, we need the talented people to tell us what to do, etc. But then in the 1920s, it becomes left-leaning. And then a couple decades later, it goes back to being, so it's like these contexts that shift. But one of the things I'm thinking about is like, some of the students in Nicaragua talk about Arielismo with what they're doing, right? So it's sort of like, if a student is doing something, if a student is protesting, that in and of itself is a manifestation of Arielismo, regardless of what they're advocating, right? I mean, so that's kind of one of the parts of the really flexible part of this, right? It's kind of, it's not inexplicable because I think that speaks to how foundational the text was and how important the ideas were throughout Latin American history, right? That people still kind of gesture to that. Even if they despise what he said, they still kind of at times can self-identify. Not entirely, of course. I'm not categorizing whole movements or protests, but there are elements within that. And that's what I found so fascinating about the Neo-Arielistas Indignados sign, right? That's sort of like, he said he was kind of messing around, but in follow-up interviews, he was kind of like, yeah, but I do buy into that. I am. And it's funny that he's queering that, right? I mean, he's very, the student in particular, his group, his cohort, are very much into putting like queer politics on the map. So, that's another kind of like reformulation of what Rodó did, considering that it was for a masculine audience exclusively.
I was wondering, could you speak a bit more about like challenging ideas or similar movements that were around at that time when it all, like in 1910, when it increased, like when it got momentum?
Yeah.
Like, was there anything similar in size? Or, I mean, if you present it seems like it was tabula rasa, there was nothing, it was kind of emptiness. So was it emptiness that drove everyone to this concept that people felt like, oh, now we finally found something that we can identify with, so now we have a label for our identity?
Right.
Or was there similar streams going on and this was just becoming dominant one?
Good. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, It's different for different groups and different places at different times, right? I mean, it's telling a very long story here, but I mean, I think after 1898, U.S. intervention in Cuba, he kind of put those anxieties on the map in a way. Other people were doing it, but he, I think one of the reasons why we're talking about him and not somebody else is because he was a self-promoter. Like, he sent copies of his book everywhere, Spain, all throughout Latin America, U.S., France. Like, read my book. So then what happened is you had Spanish people starting to review the book very early on, and it just kind of takes off, right? So it was part of like this self-marketing campaign that he did. And also it has to do with the changing conditions in print culture in Latin America, right? I mean, since the 1890s primarily, 1880s, 1890s, but really picking up steam in the early 20th century, you have a lot more magazines and periodicals being published throughout the Americas that are literary in nature. So they're reviewing books, word gets out, they publish portions of the text in those papers, people read it, people consume it, it just kind of catches fire, right? But you think about like the Mexican Revolution, right? Ateneo de la Juventud, right? El Ateneo de la Juventud in Mexico, that's an Arielista group. They read Ariel, they formed the group after reading Ariel, they acknowledge that they read the group and that. So you think about all those actors in that group, right? Antonio Caso, Vasconcelos, all these like pivotal, Max Enrique Sureña or Pedro Enrique Sureña, Dominicans living in Mexico, part of that group. They're kind of like fueled by the Arielista spirit in a way. And what was their platform? It was about the spirit, right? It can't just be like this hard like dictatorship, evolutionism, things like this, racial strife. It needs to be something transcendent, looking to the future, rising above, etc. So that's one example of kind of how, it maybe fueled things that already existed, or in some cases it kind of really prompted, people to act, as is the case with like student protagonism, especially. Yeah, thank you.
Mentioning about the, I guess, Latin American Revolution, I was thinking of the what was his position in the Cuban Revolution, for instance, like whether it was an explicit reference to the
right.
And specifically because of this, Reda Mars, for instance, Caliban's work in the 70s was specifically positioned specifically against, right?
Yes. Yeah, good question.
Was before that.
Right. Yeah. So think about like, it's well known that like Ariel influenced Castro, right? There's that AB direct line drawn, right? But at the same time, you have Retamar in 71, like you're saying, basically reformulating all these tropes, right? It can't be that like Latin America is Ariel, the United States is Caliban. He inverts that for those of you who don't know, right? And what's kind of interesting in 71, by him doing that, he kind of like refueled in a way, right? Like Rodó's relevance. Because like by the 70s, Rodó, like, it was kind of like waning a little bit. And then he comes up and says, no, it's Rodó was wrong. Like, we're Caliban. We're the people whose lands have been stolen. We've been enslaved. We're taught a language that's not our own, etc. Right? So totally inverts the tropes. But by doing that, how many thousands of things have been written because of that intervention, right? So it's interesting that at the same time you can kind of say, yeah, we can locate like Arielismo in Castro, but at the same time, like the paradigmatic, like revolutionary intellectual that Retamar comes out, combats it, but simultaneously kind of gives it a little more, another leg up in a way, right? It kind of got other people thinking about Rodó again, and then, on and on. But yeah, as far as like the Cuban Revolution as Arielismo, it's as Arielist as anything else is collectively, right? The spirit of youth reforming, you can think of like the new man, right? The Cuban new man. That's in a way a very similar kind of thing to what Rodó was advocating, a new mentality, a new way of seeing. Some of this stuff is kind of loose, right? You can kind of locate it anywhere, et cetera. But I don't think the Cuban Revolution, especially Retamar, was really like appropriating consciously Rodó. Quite the opposite. Yeah. Thank you.
Anything else?
Any questions, comments?
No. We thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming out. Thank you.